Most of you are already somewhat familiar with the situation going on at the US-Mexico border and our horrendous immigration policies. Our immigration policies were pretty shit prior to Donald Trump, but since he's been president, his administration has exacerbated the problems we already had and created new ones. The administration has illegally closed ports of entry across the border to make it harder for immigrants to get into the country legally. They revoked temporary protected status for immigrants coming from many different Central American and South American countries like Guatemala or Nicaragua or El Salvador, and is threatening to send thousands of them back to their countries that they fled rampant corruption, political instability, and violence, gang violence, and brutal economic conditions largely brought about by the US and our insane foreign policies. The infamous child separation policy that separates migrant children from their parents upon entry into the country. Epic debacle. There are still thousands of children separated from their families. There are hundreds who may never see their parents again because their parents got deported back to where they came from, but their kids are still here and they have no idea how to get in contact with them. We basically have concentration camps across the country where we are indefinitely detaining thousands of migrants who come into this country fleeing all of those problems that I already listed before. The conditions in these concentration camps are horrendous. They are overcrowded and understaffed. There are reports of children being beaten and sexually abused in these concentration camps. A judge ordered one of those facilities in Texas closed because of the way they were treating children. There were reports that kids were drinking water out of the toilets, eating expired food, being drugged against their will with antipsychotic medication unnecessarily so that they would lay in their cages and not cause too many problems for the guards who are supervising them. We are drugging kids with powerful psychotic medication just so they can sit still and be quiet. The kids are sleeping on concrete floors with thin mats between the floor and them and some shitty paper-thin foil blankets. Again, this detention seems to be indefinite because they've been held for months at this point with no plan at all on when they would be released, which is illegal, by the way. And I did not misspeak when I called these concentration camps because it's exactly what they are. People have this weird idea that the only way something can be a concentration camp is if it fits the most extreme version of the Nazi concentration camps back during the Holocaust. That's just a fundamental misunderstanding of definitions. Here's a definition of a concentration camp, and tell me if it doesn't fit our, quote, detention facilities perfectly. A place where large numbers of people, especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities, are deliberately imprisoned in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities, sometimes to provide forced labor or to await mass execution. By the way, there are already reports of immigrants doing forced labor at these camps in the US. It's true that these are concentration camps, though almost no one in the media or the Democratic Party is willing to call it what it is because it makes the country seem cruel and barbaric. Instead, they're going to Dick Cheney it by using the government-approved euphemisms like enhanced interrogation instead of torture. And in this case, immigration detention facilities instead of concentration camps to make it sound like legit official government business. Well, I'm going to call them exactly what they are, which is concentration camps. All of this leads me to the news that broke this weekend that John Kelly, Donald Trump's former chief of staff who left the White House a couple months ago, is now on the board of a corporation that owns some of these concentration camps or, quote, immigration detention facilities. What has been the main narrative that mainstream media, and honestly even some people in independent media, have been pushing about John Kelly the entire time he's been in the Trump administration? They've been calling John Kelly an honorable man and saying that he's one of the good guys and that he's, quote, the adult in the room of the Trump administration. So where's the evidence that Kelly is this upstanding guy like they've said over and over again? There is none. It's entirely made up. This lionization of John Kelly was just entirely fabricated by the mainstream media. It wasn't based on his past record or policy positions, because anyone who's judging John Kelly by his record and those positions would know that he's not a great guy. But you know where this narrative came from, right? All of this praise for Kelly comes from the fact that he was a general in the military. That's it. For the political establishment and the media establishment, if you're someone in the military, you are considered sacred and above reproach. It is considered sacrilege and political suicide to say anything negative about them or even criticize them in an accurate way. The undeserved deference that the mainstream media in the US has towards authority figures, whether it's police officers or someone in the military, it's honestly childlike and somewhat disturbing. When Trump picked him to be the Secretary of Homeland Security and then later his Chief of Staff, there was nothing but a round of applause by the mainstream media sucking off John Kelly. Yes, we finally have someone to restore civility and decorum in the White House once again, with the dear Honorable Saint Overlord General John Kelly. May the strong guiding hand of this square-jawed military professional lead our country to greatness and safety. But again, if you look at his record and now his time at the White House, it's very clear that he's just a far right-wing sycophant lunatic like everyone else Trump hires. Before he even came into the administration, Kelly has made several public statements that are concerning. First of all, he's a warmonger who fervently supports literally every single military action that the US has been involved in since the fucking dawn of time. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, going back to fucking Vietnam, I'm sure, the Korean War, bombing the shit out of Cambodia. There is nothing off limits for John Kelly. There was no military operation that were unnecessary or unjustified if you ask John Kelly. That right there is already a problem, because we all know that the rampant militarism of the United States, the out-of-control military-industrial complex, the U.S. empire has gone way out of control, and anyone who doesn't see that, you have to question their judgment. Furthermore, he fundamentally does not understand the way our government is set up. Kelly has said that no civilian has any right criticizing the U.S. military or their actions. This is very basic civics that honestly all adults should know, and definitely anyone in government or the military should know. The US technically is not some type of military junta where the generals are on top and everyone else in the country just does as they say. It's the exact opposite. The way our government is set up, we have civilian oversight and control of the military. The president is a civilian. The Secretary of Defense, who's in charge of the Pentagon and all three branches of the military, is almost always a civilian. Congress, who authorizes the military budget and has the power to declare war, as well as other oversight powers, they're civilians. So honestly, it's kind of scary that someone who is at such a high level, a general and a commander of the most powerful military on the planet, even thinks this. This shows his deeply authoritarian nature. John Kelly and all of his other elitist general commander friends who are in his circle are so drunk off their own power that they think that they are the rulers of the world. They can wage war and do all types of war crimes that they want with impunity, and no one outside of the military chain of command has any right to question them for their actions. The fact that he's a defender of US empire and the endless wars, the torture, the destruction of entire countries and regions, combined with the fact that he just fundamentally does not understand how our government is structured in regards to civilian oversight of the military, while he was a general in the military, should have been red flags to everyone that he was just some authoritarian far right winger. In my opinion, if this was a sane world, everyone should have been shocked and outraged that Trump picked John Kelly to be his chief of staff or Homeland Security secretary. But of course, that's not the world we live in. Instead, the media loves to bring up this shitty talking point that John Kelly is, quote, the adult in the room at the White House. And they repeated that up until the day he left the White House. I still think that's giving John Kelly way too much credit. I mean, Kelly, who helped push through the ridiculous, absurd, multi-trillions of dollars in tax cuts for the rich that also raised taxes on anyone else making less than $70,000 a year. I know almost nobody talks about that tax bill that the Republicans passed anymore, but that thing was just so beyond the pale. That tax law was one of the biggest heists perpetrated on the working class in this country in service of the top 1% and the richest, most elite people in the country. And it was entirely gratuitous and unnecessary. We already had historic income inequality in this country. Yet the White House and the Republican Party decided to dig the knife in a little deeper by taking even more money from the working class to give to the rich. And mind you, this was one of the only actual pieces of legislation that the Republicans passed the entire time Trump's been in the White House. So Republicans have the White House, they have the Senate, and their first priority is to fuck over working people. If John Kelly was any kind of adult in the room, his hair would have been on fire. He would have said, you guys are fucking crazy and this is bad for the economy and it's bad for the country. Instead, he went out and lied to the media about it. He lied to the American people about it. He was wheeling and dealing on Congress to make things happen behind the scenes. And then when it did finally pass, he was praising it as one of the biggest achievements in the Trump administration. This is another example of John Kelly not being the adult in the room, but instead being a far right-wing elitist. Kelly was at the White House executing all of Donald Trump's shitty policies, all the regime change wars, all of the military escalations in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and in Yemen. While he was chief of staff, the U.S. dropped more bombs in Afghanistan in 1 year than we have the entire duration of what's about to be an 18-year war. While he was chief of staff, the U.S. gratuitously dropped the mother of all bombs, the largest non-nuclear weapon that the U.S. has in our arsenal, wreaking havoc in parts of Afghanistan and, of course, killing civilians unnecessarily. He was pushing the Obamacare repeal that would have kicked 30 million people off of their insurance, raised prices for everyone else, jack up deductibles, jack up premiums, jack up co-pays, and get rid of protections for pre-existing conditions. You can just go down the list and you see how John Kelly has been an instrument implementing all of these terrible right-wing policies coming out of the Trump White House. So I think it was entirely irresponsible for the mainstream media and some people in independent media to soften John Kelly's image during his whole time in the Trump administration. The next point I want to make is the hiring of John Kelly to this board is entirely corruption. This is what happens in DC. You get into all of these high-ranking government positions where you have the power to influence policy, and while you're there, instead of working on behalf of the American people, which is your fucking job, while you're there, you do policies that serve specific industries or several industries. Then when you finally get out of government and it's legal for those industries to pay you back for your service to them, that's when the retroactive bribes kick in. As soon as you're out of government, you go to the industry that you served and you say it's time to pay up. Then they give you some nice cushy job as an advisor, an executive, or board member who gets paid millions of dollars a year to not really do anything. Because what other qualifications does John Kelly have to be on the board of a company that runs concentration camps or, quote, detention centers? He's not an immigration lawyer or a healthcare professional or a financial expert or any of those things. His only qualifications are that while he was in government, he pushed right-wing immigration policies that gave billions of dollars to the detention facility industry. The specific policies that they liked were the indefinite detention of immigrants, the child separation policy, the revoking of temporary protected status for immigrants already in the country, changing the asylum claims process, mass deportations across the country. All of those things require the government to write huge contracts to this industry so that they could build facilities to house these immigrants that they're detaining indefinitely without any cause. Before I said this was entirely corruption, let me slightly amend that. John Kelly's decision to go there was maybe 90% corruption and 10% he just has this weird affinity for hardline right-wing immigration policy. John Kelly was the chief of staff to the White House and he was a general and all that other bullshit. I'm sure that if he wanted to, he could have got a job basically anywhere he wanted to, but instead he chose to be on the board of this organization that runs concentration camps. So what does that say about John Kelly? Obviously, he didn't disagree too much with Donald Trump's immigration policies if he was implementing them the whole time he was at the White House, unabashed. And now that he's out of the White House, he's still involved in those hardline immigration policies and running concentration camps. But this here's the last point I want to make. The revolving door is a huge problem in politics. It's not just John Kelly. Nikki Haley, who was Donald Trump's UN ambassador and rabid warmonger, spent her entire time in the administration provoking and escalating conflicts around the world. And as soon as she leaves, she gets a multi-million-dollar job to sit on the board of Boeing, one of the largest defense contractors in the world, making billions of dollars and selling weapons and military equipment. The Clintons pushed hard for Wall Street deregulation their whole time in government. Bill Clinton got rid of Glass-Steagall, which was a huge part of what led to the financial crash of 2008. So what did the two of them do as soon as they get out of government? Went and did huge fucking paid speeches, getting millions of dollars just to talk to a couple bankers for a few hours. The same thing with Barack Obama. Tool for Wall Street, and as soon as he's out of office, first thing he does, giving speeches to financial institutions for $400,000 an hour. Dick Cheney was the defense secretary under George H.W. Bush. The second he was done being defense secretary, he goes and he works as an executive at Halliburton, getting paid millions of dollars at one of the largest defense contractors in the world. Then George W. Bush picks Dick Cheney to be his vice president. He leaves Halliburton, gets paid tens of millions of dollars in an exit package, which is essentially a bribe because they know he's going back into government. Then when he's in office, then when he's in the White House as vice president, he illegally starts the Iraq War, kills over 1 million civilians, and gives Halliburton the largest no-bid contracts of the war at the time. So this revolving door is really fucking gross. It's almost as bad as private money in campaigns. Honestly, you can even make the case that it's worse because it's so egregious and so clearly a bribe in all of those examples that I just gave you. Unlike the campaign contributions, this starts to get into the territory of just regular old personal corruption, because in those instances, those are the only time when industry and corporations can directly put cash in politicians' pockets. So it's really a payment saying you were a good little tool while you were in government. So here's a giant pile of money for your corruption and all the corrupt policies that you pushed that ended up making my company and my industry insanely rich. So yeah, we need a constitutional amendment to ban private money in campaigns and politics. But we also have to do something about the revolving door. Because, I mean, shit, corruption will still be off the chain if we ban private money in campaigns and ban lobbying, but you can still serve industry while you're in government, and then as soon as you get out, get paid multiple millions of dollars to do not a goddamn thing, but to collect a check for your previous corruption in government.